for you guys. We got Snake Was Right and John Maddox. They're going to be debating intelligent design or naturalism. We're really looking forward to this one, so I want to thank the debaters for giving us their time. Just a few announcements. First off, I hope everybody is well during this crazy time. We've worked hard to set up a lot of streams, debates, discussions for the next couple weeks, so we got a lot to be excited about. This week, for example, Wednesday, myself, I'll be debating Mark Drysdale on modern day debate. And Sunday, Rom, Adam, myself, we're going to be taking on zoologist Adam Heap. He's been on our channel before, so we're really looking forward to that one. As well as the Film Free will be taking on Speed of Sound sometime this week. We were supposed to have that last night, but Speed of Sound is feeling a little sick, so hopefully he gets well soon. Anybody talk to him in the chat or anything, give him your wishes. So, and a few more as well. But what we'll do here is we'll hand it over to the debaters. Looks like Snake Was Right is going to be starting. But before we go to the opening, Snake, if you wanted to give a brief just introduction of yourself. I'm sure everybody knows who you are, but just a couple things about your channel, what you're doing, and then we'll do the same with John.
Sure. Thanks for having me on. My channel is basically skepticism of a lot of things. I guess going way back, I started off with some historical stuff. If you can put your swords on your back, and those were my most successful videos. But I go for what interests me at the moment. So recently, I've just been doing mostly creationism and kind of atheism related stuff, and hoping to get into like libertarian politics pretty soon, and just I like discussing anything. Lately, like I've been listening to a lot of like Joe Rogan, and so he's not an atheist, but I would describe myself as maybe like a spiritual atheist. I don't believe in like actual souls or anything like that, but I think there is like some transcendental truths and stuff like that. So I mean, religion's always really interested me in the metaphorical sense, but not in the literal sense. So I try to bridge those worlds and kind of bring some science into it, and yeah.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much for that introduction, Snake. I appreciate it. Of course, I want to thank you as well that you're always open and available to debate. So, we definitely appreciate that. And also, before we go on to John, I do want to say to the audience, we'll have a short question and answer after the debate is done. So if you want to tag either myself or Praise I Am That I Am, we'll save your questions for the Q&A period. Okay, John, you're up.
Well, guys, thanks for having me on the show. Snake, appreciate you being willing to have this conversation. A lot of these things that we're discussing, and really the reason that I started my channel was that about 8 years ago, I almost died of a massive brain hemorrhage. And according to neurologists and neurosurgeons, I'm a walking, talking miracle. And that really sparked me to start going down the proverbial rabbit holes regarding existence. And I'm a very analytical person, so I began researching quantum mechanics and biology and genetics and all these different aspects of science, looking for answers in relation to existence. And the deeper I went, the more it seemed to be the logical conclusion was that there was a higher power and that we could not exist without the intelligent agent being required. And anyway, that started my channel, which is called Logical, Plausible, Probable. And there I'm breaking down different aspects of both from a psychology perspective as well as a scientific one. And I'm working on some more spiritual ones now too. But really looking at how is what we're being told in modern society impacting our worldview, and are we being given the right information, and are we ultimately asking the right questions?
Awesome. Well, I really appreciate that introduction there, John. Also, for anybody watching, we'll make sure we have the debaters channel links in the description box. So if you want to learn more about the either John or Snake. So we'll hand it off to Snake. As far as the debate goes, we're going to have very flexible openings, 5 minutes max. I'll set my timer for that. We'll jump into about a 40 or 45-minute discussion, ending with a quick Q&A. So like I said, make sure you tag me in the live chat, and we'll be sure to ask your questions. So we'll hand it over to you, Snake. I'll set the timer for 5 minutes, and we'll go from there.
All right. So I basically take the view of naturalism, I guess, because I don't really see any evidence of anything else, and at least from how I would see, if there was gods or some kind of so-called supernaturalism at work, I would still see that as naturalism, not just because I want to like always like be right or something like that, but I would see anything that exists as natural. Even I guess it depends on context. Where there's a context where of anything humans do basically is not natural, and everything else is natural. But the way I understand like the more broad context of natural is anything that actually is able to come about by the rules of the universe is natural. And if a god or some spirit being is the result of the laws of the universe, that would seem natural to me. And also, I don't really know what supernatural would mean in along the same veins, because it would need to still obey some kind of rules. It can't just obey random rules, or else nothing could really result from it. So I guess we could talk about what supernaturalism means, or anything like that. It would be interesting to talk about maybe why surviving something very unlikely would make you turn to religion. Like why wouldn't you believe that science or medical science alone could save you, even if it's very unlikely? And going back to kind of the original statement, I don't see any evidence of anything outside of what would be classically considered naturalism. I just hold to the scientific method, and so basically I'm open to anything, but it needs to pass the basic scientific method test for me. And along the lines of like evolution, I guess, it can be, I don't mind what we actually end up talking about, but if we dive into evolution, I would say that passes the scientific method for me, because every mechanism that is supposedly a part of evolution has been observed and tested, and we can make predictions that follow the model, and that's basically how all other sciences work, and that works out pretty well for us. And as far as like going back further for origins, I'm not very well versed in like astronomy and things like that. I'm a little bit versed in abiogenesis, but I also really like to talk about why anything exists at all, and that would tie into like, you know, why is there a god, and how does a god exist as well. So I'm basically skeptical of a god, because I will go in and assume there are gods, and I write fiction about gods, and I can't really wrap my head around the kind of god that is the metaphysically primary thing of the universe. All the gods that I can conceive of are dependent upon some other truth, and I wouldn't necessarily call it a higher truth, just something that is true independent of the God. And the God I would describe as still a greater being, because it is a being like that would be greater than the sum of its parts, but it's still made out of parts, if you get what I'm saying. So I guess we can take several directions, whatever you want to talk about.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much for that opening there, Snake. What we'll do now is hand it over to John. I'll set the timer for 5 minutes. Take your time, brother.
Well, thanks, Snake. I mean, you're bringing up a lot of interesting topics. A lot of stuff is, very philosophical. I'm really coming here. I'm happy to discuss some of those things. But tonight, I'm really coming to do this with a pretty singular intent. As I undertake this conversation, this debate with you, it's really my objective to convince you, hopefully, but definitely those who are watching, that given what we now know are the requirements for life, its stunning complexity and artistic beauty, these things are made possible by nanotechnologies that far exceed our imagination and, in reality, our comprehension. And we take these for granted in our daily lives. And I would argue that without an intelligent agent, when you actually go down all of the rabbit holes, the logical conclusion is that we could not exist without one. And, as you consider the positions and the arguments I'm going to make in favor of an intelligent creator, I really hope that you, Snake, and then anybody that's listening and watching this now or in the future, I ask you remove your personal opinions about religion, bad things that are happening in life, and the shades of incredulity that are often pushed by opponents of an intelligent creator. Let's review the evidence, the legal term prima facie, and use the incredible ability for reason that's possessed only by humanity. Hopefully you won't be one of those, but many opponents I've come up in the past have pushed and tried to circumvent what I view as the truth from the average person. And I think this definitely applies in relation to pretty much all variants of Darwinism, which in my opinion is reliant on a dogmatic naturalism and reductive materialism. And by the in my opinion, stunning assumption that abiogenesis is not relevant to its very core, everything they're pushing forth is therefore the fruit of a poison tree and needs to be treated as such, just like you would in the court of law. And I found it extraordinarily fascinating that in an attempt to circumvent what I consider an inescapable enigma, people try to downplay the mind-bending lack of plausibility and probability required for abiogenesis to occur without an intelligent agent being involved. And one of those common things which I find just mind-blowing is that the supposed foundational proof for chance abiogenesis and ultimately it extrapolates out to evolution, that excludes the need for a creator, and I say things like, life exists, therefore, no matter how improbable, it must have occurred in this fashion through purely undirected natural outcomes. I would argue that this is quite possibly the most illogical conclusion that's ever been put forth on a subject as important as our very existence. And there's an innumerable number of things that are possible, but in any other context, no sane person would ever posit they could exist without the intelligent agent being required as a catalyst for its initial inception. So it's rather ironic that those who deny the need for a creator also demand we conclude that all these things are possible by chance. So it's my argument that to reach this staunch belief for our very existence requires the suspension of rational thought. So as you consider, the conversation that Snake and I are having, think about, as they're expanded, ask yourself this: who is really the one succumbing to the common God of the gaps argument mindset? Is it the people who are like myself, who are concluding that it is more logical, plausible, and probable that these things could not occur by chance? Or is it those who argue, no matter how counterintuitive it is, you must believe that this could all happen without a designer being required? To wrap up, I would contend that the evidence in favor of our intelligent creator is a self-evident truth. And while people like Snake, to certain degrees, try to escape what I consider this to be an ultimate truth, I think they're being forced to kneel before the gods of chance and chaos to explain their existence. Yield my time.
Awesome. John, thanks so much for that opening statement. Now we're going to jump into the best part, of course, of any debate. Once again, guys, in the live chat, I've got a few questions saved, so tag myself or praise I am that I am. But that being said, I've got the timer going for about 40 or 45 minutes worth of discussion. So whoever wants to start it off, go ahead, Snake and John.
So do you mostly have a problem with evolution, or primarily abiogenesis, or like the existence of the universe itself as a whole?
Personally, I think they're all conjoined in that. If you really want to go down the quantum mechanics and just the cosmological side of things, we can go all the way to there if you want to. But I think they all show, excluding evolution, because I think the neo-Darwinian position, which ironically is collapsing in the last decade, very publicly collapsing, not to the outliers, people out in the rest of the world, but in the scientific community, it's definitely starting to collapse as so many different discoveries are being made. So I say that one in and of itself is a back to my earlier point of my statement of fruit of a poison tree. There's such an aggressive move to differentiate between abiogenesis and evolution, when in reality it's nothing more than an extension of it. So the abiogenesis requires undirected chemical evolution to take place, and was posited as evolution in the general sense now is that other chemical variations are occurring, and there's no additional variables outside of just natural process of deterministic chemistry. And that has been relatively eviscerated in science over the last 30 years, especially. And I find it interesting that people so adamantly argue for the differentiation when they're very symbiotic.
So I don't see how they're connected at all, because there are people who believe that God incepted the first life forms that then evolved.
I'm not really sure how that has relevance to what people want to tell themselves versus what is actually a realistic position to take when you really go down to the ultimate root of the argument and the position that's being taken. I could care less if somebody says, "Oh, I think God did it." The reality is that the evidence now shows that without direct, the theistic evolutionists, not all, but the majority of them, I think you're probably referring to, think they just, happened via natural, but God made it possible to happen. I'm stating that without direct intervention, it is not a realistic conclusion that, whether or not you want to believe in evolution or not, for the extenuation of life forms, that it's never going to have happened without the action of an intelligent agent.
So why not? What science says that?
Well, why don't you tell me your position on abiogenesis, and we can take it from there.
Basically, most of the organic molecules can form by natural processes, and we've seen that. And most of the components of simple cells can form by naturalistic forces as well.
That's a false statement.
How so?
Well, okay. Before I dive into this, which specific organic components do you think can form through natural process?
Lipids,
without undirected natural process.
Lipids, carbohydrates, amino acids, and nucleic acids. And so I guess that would you consider an experiment in a lab as directed?
Of course.
Even though it's just replicating natural circumstances?
Well, and there's actually multiple papers on this, as I'm sure you're probably aware, that the supposedly natural processes are requiring hypothetical variables, number one, very controlled scenarios, and are also being able to leverage extraordinarily pure components that are required for these different organic compounds to be around in the first place. And when you actually look at the, having the parts of something versus the end result, and you said that, protocells, basic cells, whatever, that is a completely false statement on cells just forming themselves and all that kind of stuff. That has not even come close to happening. That's admitted by the Lee Cronins of the world and a variety of the supposedly leading origin of life researchers. And many of the newspaper articles, magazine articles that have been published, not from the journals, but from the more on the public facing side, they've massively downplay what was actually being considered a new cell. I mean, if you take all the pieces, put them all together, and then inject a nucleus in there that's already existing, you have not created a new cell. You've taken the most important components that are required, put them all together, and then said, hey, here's a cell. But it did not come from scratch.
So that science is in process, so I don't see how that proves that, therefore, an intelligent God is the only way to do that, because there's more and more published on that all the time. And they actually have made self-replicating, I would describe them as simple cells. They're called Jiwanu. That was made like almost 40, probably longer years ago. They don't have any genetic material, but they do have a cell wall, and they self-replicate. So we're constantly getting closer and closer to that point. So I don't see anything that conclusively shows that only an intelligence can do it.
Okay, so that's where it gets interesting. And since judging from your, I read your profile on your channel, and you're a cell biologist, correct?
Oh, well, I'm getting educated in cell biology, yeah.
Okay. So what are the fundamentals of a cell being able to function? What is required?
It's got to have basically a vesicle made out of cells have lipids as their outside, and that basically isolates what's inside, which is would be genetic material, at least eventually. But then there are simpler and simpler versions of that don't require genetic material that could be transitioned to genetic material.
So is it I think you very much simplified things beyond what is actually being considered a realistic proposition for life. But the last paper I read showed that the simplest possible form of life would need about 500,000 genetic base pairs in order to exist, and not including all the other components they're either chicken and egg derived from the DNA itself and the other components that transcribe it and express the information, or are not actually contained in the DNA itself and self-replicate on their own from other pieces but also require proteins, which came from the genetic code, which I think is interesting. But if you need 500,000 base pairs in specific sequence, the probability of that happening is so mind-blowing, especially when you consider the information coding logic that is required inside of those sequences. So the question I would have for you is, if genetic code is required and it's structured information-based, information theory, substantiated logic, how do you propose that these things came into existence without just by pure chance? You have to have the probability is I believe 4 to the 5,120th that 5,000 or 500,000 base pairs ended up in the appropriate sequence for the simplest form of life to exist. So I would ask you, how do you propose that would actually happen?
Well, first of all, the probabilities under those calculations are completely incorrect, because that's just comparing all possible conformations with one possible conformation, and that's not really how it works. It works on deterministic properties. So there are certain conformations of, say, RNA, like in the RNA world hypothesis, that are far more likely than all the others, especially when you're just working with really simple ones. So some are just deterministically more probable to happen, and so
No, dude, you're absolutely wrong on that.
Nope.
There was actually a paper published on this last year by some guys challenging the standard RNA world hypothesis directly under the context of the syntax requirement of the genetic code is not based on deterministic principles. And because of and this has been a well-established known fact for a while, because of the chemical neutrality, there is no reason for there to be any deterministic aspect of why they would end up in specific sequences. So you do go back to completely random probabilities, and people are always trying to circumvent that reality, but it is it's a fact in chemistry. You can't avoid it. So you can't avoid the probabilities.
I'm just saying that you're not going to get complex genes out of that. Those are out of the probability, and those are usually included in the probabilities to make it seem larger. So there are random.
No.
Yeah. So there are random conformations of the RNA in prebiotic RNA world, and
the formation of self-replicating RNA does not account for the non-random sequencing that's required for genetic code. That is the foundational component and the flaw of basically all of the RNA, or all of the current abiogenesis theories, is that they all ultimately require non-random syntax and sequencing to enable the sequencing of genetic code in the first place. So if you can't get around that component, and there's a zillion papers on this, and they all go back to, well, I guess we have to look at a frozen accident component to our overall theory, which is a fancy way of saying somehow this randomly happened. You know that, and I know that.
It's not. It's the differences between them are essentially random, but what they form, some of the conformations are more likely because they're smaller. So an RNA is just.
What do you mean smaller conformations are more probable? What does that mean?
So you're going to be working with much smaller sequences than complex genes that we're looking at today.
Okay, how do you possibly come to that conclusion if you're talking about the I believe the shortest functional protein they have come across, I think, was 42 amino acids. So when you look at the probabilities on that, I think you come out to I think it's 1 in 10 to the 52nd for that shortest functional protein, and that doesn't change the sequence required, and that's just for one protein. And for for a life form to exist, you have to have a heck of a lot more than just one gene working. And that's the 500,000 base pairs being in the appropriate sequences accounts for all the different required genes. I mean, at a minimum, you have to have gene expression proteins, and you got to have tRNA, and even if you want to go the very boiled down ribosome argument, you still have to have a ridiculous amount of different components all working in synchronicity and all existing at the same time in the same location. So the reason I say in context of intelligent design, it's, if you want to argue, oh, okay, cool, this one might have happened, and it's not completely improbable or impossible for it to have done so, you're talking about on the things on the molecular level. So ultimately, you're arguing that things that are extraordinarily improbable all happened at the same time in the same physical place, and there were no errors that occurred in all this
No.
stuff coming together.
Well, it occurred if you consider, excuse me, if you consider like billions of years to be the same time, then sure. And errors are assumed in this. There's going to be mostly errors, and then when one has a function, that one will stick around because it will outcompete the others.
You're talking about evolution. We're talking about abiogenesis. What's the
Some of the mechanisms are very similar.
What is the shelf life, average shelf life of an RNA molecule?
It's not as long.
It's about 20. It's about 20 minutes.
But that's where lipid bilayers come in, so they can protect them.
Now you have to have lipid bilayers that have occurred and are surrounding the RNA molecule that has a 20-minute shelf life. And they have 20-minute shelf lives inside of our dramatically more advanced cells that we have now, right? So in the extraordinarily chaotic scenario that we're talking about from the, from your worldview, we've got a chaotic environment that has none of the standard protections that ours currently do. And you have, for a minimum, you have a 500,000 base pair genome being required. And you're required to have proteins that have been executed and exist. But wait a minute, the ability for them to come from the genetic code that hasn't been formed yet also doesn't exist. So the premise of, they just stuck around and outcompeted the others is, in my opinion, it's like a fantasy of, this thing that usually lasts for 20 minutes hung out, and somehow, even if this other protein magically formed on the other side of the planet, it somehow made its way over to where this one was, where this RNA is starting to form. I mean, it's just, I don't understand how you can actually think that's actually a reasonable thought outside of just pure imagination.
Because we're getting closer to it all the time. And so is your argument basically that because it's not fully solved, therefore God did it?
No. I'm just talking about the very basics of what is having to be justified by those who think that there isn't an intelligent agent required. Is you've got, I find it very funny how the atheists, and I'm not sure, you said you're spiritualist, whatever you are, very often or come back with I think it's kind of where you were going with this, and the whole God of the gaps aspect. And the point I'm making is that when you start to look at all of the components that are required that are improbable past the amount of time that has occurred in the number of instances of chemical actions that have happened per the standard model, that somehow those things that shouldn't even be able to have been possible for one of them somehow all happened simultaneously and came together in a coherent fashion and then extrapolated out. I mean, to me, that is just that's why I use the term, gods of chance and chaos is what is being put forth when you look at all this stuff. And I mean, transition into some of the more aspects of biology here. One of the positions I like to take is, if you look at genetic code and all the different robots that are required for life, that we all know are required for life, it is just like positing that somehow a programming language created itself, then the robots needed to build your iPhone created themselves, and then somehow the programming language became coherent software operating system, injected itself into your cell phone, and then from there a bunch of apps started creating, and then presto, we now have self-replicating cell phones all over the place, and new apps are popping up all every month. It's or every million years, whatever you want to put on from the time scale. And to me, if you actually made that similar type of argument, which I think is extraordinarily and I can go way deeper than that, but you can look at direct comparisons from a technology perspective. If you actually made that that argument with a straight face to somebody and said you actually believed that regarding your cell phone, they would look at you like you were an idiot. And like, what kind of a fantasy land are you living in? And when you look at life forms, the level of technology and complexity is so many exponential levels greater than what we come up with in a phone. To me, to argue that that happened without a supreme intelligence knows how all this stuff works, putting it together, is just it's a dream to escape the reality of that individual existing.
Well, if the binary code could self-assemble in nature, it wouldn't be ridiculous at all. I mean, the other thing with RNA is that DNA can form naturally as well, and DNA can stabilize RNA. So you can get a basic self-replication with a single strand of DNA. If it's inside a cell, it can be protected, or a lipid bilayer, it can be protected, and any amino acids that come in can assemble into an RNA strand, and it can keep making the exact same strand over and over and over. So, I mean, and maybe, I don't know.
Wait, hang on. Did you just say that what are those amino acids turning into?
Into chains of RNA or DNA.
No, what are the amino acids turning into?
What I said is they're turning into RNA and DNA.
Amino acids do not turn into RNA and DNA. Amino acids turn into proteins.
Sorry, I misspoke. The nucleotides.
Okay, but you're talking about amino acids now. How is DNA and RNA outside of a few subsets? How is DNA replicated?
Usually, well, what do you mean? In the abiogenesis model, or
in what we actually observe? Not postulate. In what we actually observe, how is DNA replicated?
It's because you have the nucleotides, and they line up with either another DNA or an RNA strand.
No, how is it replicated?
In a modern cell?
Yeah, how's it replicated?
Well, there's whole classes on that.
It's pretty simple to explain.
I mean, how is
DNA replicated? How is a gene expressed to create a protein or any other kind of function inside of a cell? How is it expressed? What's the process?
Genes are expressed through translation, but that's not the same as replication.
It's actually extraordinarily similar processes in the actual function. I'm asking, let's go back to what I first said.
Replication of DNA is a lot simpler than transcription of genes.
I'd say they're both extraordinarily complicated. You're right. There's a lot more variables on expression. But I'm saying, what is the actual process, and what are the pieces that are required for everything that we observe about DNA replication? What happens? What's the process?
The basics is that one of the strands is exposed, and then nucleotides are just matched to that exposed strand.
How?
Well, without the simplest way is it's literally just an exposed strand, and there are nucleotides just floating around in the water, and they're attracted by chemical attraction.
Okay. That's almost a childlike description. So there are
trying to keep it simple.
But keeping it simple is avoiding the entire point of why an intelligent agent is required for this to happen. Are there or are there not multiple protein nanomachines that are required to bind with the DNA, expose, as you said, a component of it or a strand of it? But how does that actually work? You've got one of them that literally spins the entire thing at the speed of a jet engine. You have multiple other pieces that are, you have another one that's copying part of it backwards and forwards. You have spell check components built into the proteins that check to see if mismatches have happened of those base pairs. Have you not?
Yeah, but you don't need that for prebiotic conditions.
Yeah. Okay, so are those same pieces that I'm describing, are they also used for gene expression to create proteins?
Sometimes, yeah.
Sometimes or always?
No, not all of them, but
So you're saying
some
that
of them are the
you're saying
same.
that genes do not require the multiple, very complex nanomachine robots in order for them to be expressed to go create a protein.
Sorry, say it again.
Are you saying that there are any genes that can be expressed without transcription factors being required?
No, you need a transcription factor.
Okay. So you have a ultimate chicken and egg problem, because even if your DNA has somehow managed to form itself and you still haven't explained the syntax or the information component that is housed therein within the genetic code, now you're faced with not having the transcription factors and the nanomachine protein robots needed to actually execute the code. So where do the proteins come from?
They're made of amino acids.
Okay, and how are they put together to create a functional protein?
With the ribosome, which is made out of RNA, coincidentally,
RNA and
other stuff. It's mostly RNA, though.
actually, I think there's like 82 different components, 50 of which are proteins, 23 are RNAs, and there's like a central RNA component. But it's a combination of different components, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So in everything that we observe in cellular biology right now, are the transcription factors and those different components we discussed, and a fully functional ribosome required for gene expression?
You wouldn't start off with a modern ribosome, though.
No, I'm talking about in what we observe in right now. Are they required
For translation?
for gene expression and translation?
Yes.
Okay. And then how do the amino acids get to the ribosome?
They're just in the solution.
How are they physically transported to the ribosome in order to be catalyzed?
Vesicles?
No. tRNAs. How now this brings us to
vesicles.
Now this brings us back to the foundation of all of this, which for me is just a mind bender, which is the genetic code and the communication process of encode, transmission, decode, and execution. So how does the ribosome know which amino acid it needs to put in which order when that gene arrives over to it, or the mRNA arrives?
The ribosome doesn't know.
Then how does it happen then?
It's just in a shape so that amino acids will glom onto the sequence, the codons that they match.
Okay, so it's your supposition that the ribosome has no ability to determine whether or not the appropriate amino acid is being matched up with the mRNA. Is that correct?
No.
I think that's what you just said. So how does if the wrong amino acid comes in, how is it being determined that it's the incorrect one or the correct one for that specific protein that's being built?
You want to go into the actual chemical mechanisms?
Yeah, because I want to know the process. How does it happen? And we can talk about the chemistry as well.
Well, it doesn't matter because we're talking about the modern ribosomes.
The one
they're well-modeled, simpler ribosomes that are more relevant to abiogenesis.
They are completely hypothetical in terms of what is actually being required to execute the genetic code, which we all agree is required to have somehow formed in abiogenesis. So I'm asking you, how does the ribosome, even in a simpler form, how does it know which amino acid is the correct one in relation to the mRNA that has arrived to it?
Well, I don't know what you're getting at. Why don't you just say what you want to say?
Well, I want to know if you know.
I don't know what you're trying to get at.
Okay, so
You're just trying to say that it's so complicated it couldn't have arrived naturally.
I'm not saying it's so complicated. Let's go back to the genetic code. Do you think that the genetic code is equivalent to a real code, number one, and has direct corollary, not just analogy, to programming machine languages? Or do you think it is just or do you think it's just chemical reactions?
It's just chemical reactions, which, I mean, binary is similar.
Okay, so
but it's not similar to like a written language.
Okay, so there's a lot of papers, people that disagree with you, and the fact says syntax, semantics, pragmatics, and reductionism, redundancies, synonyms, all sorts of other components. But I'm talking about purely from a machine language
perspective.
Those
are nice analogies, but they are
no longer considered analogies. They are directly considered direct corollaries. Now, how does
you can't write a sentence with DNA? At least not the way you're talking about.
You can't write it. You don't think you could do that if you wanted to with the appropriate syntax?
You can write down language in DNA if you code for it. Like you have a decoder, but it doesn't actually have an inherent meaning.
Right. So is the ribosome a decoder, a translating decoder of the information that is contained inside of a gene sequence?
Not the way I was talking about. It would be just the sequence.
Okay, so this goes back. Okay, so this goes back to why I say people are dodging the root component of why there's an intelligent designer is the logical conclusion. So whether or not you want to accept this, it is a well-established fact, and for the most part, in the majority of circles of academia, it is the genetic code is considered exactly that, a code that completely follows all of the aspects of information and communication theory. Most important, not most importantly, but very importantly, one, and this is why I bring up the ribosome, tRNAs, amino acids matching and whatnot. As I'm sure you know this, and we'll probably agree, the codon sequence is representative of a specific amino acid. Is that right?
Say again.
Is it a codon, a specific codon? Is it representative of, symbolic of a specific amino acid?
It's no. It from our models of it, sure, but it's just matches up chemically. It doesn't have some inherent meaning to it.
So how do you postulate that if the codon never interacts chemically with the amino acid?
How do I postulate if it doesn't? Because it has a chemical middleman, which is the ribosome.
Okay, how does the ribosome and the mRNA? Okay,
if it just was symbolic of it, it would just magically match to it for no reason.
How does
which is not believable, which is not supported by science.
How does the tRNA match up with the codons when it's been bound to the ribosome?
Certain nucleotides match to other certain nucleotides.
So codon, anticodon, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And at the other end of the tRNA molecule is the amino acid, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Does the codon, which is contained in the mRNA, ever chemically interact with the amino acid that is being held by the tRNA?
Not directly, and that's another thing why I don't believe in intelligent design, is because it's all just a giant Rube Goldberg machine that no God would actually design, because he could design it simpler.
Okay, so you're saying,
I don't understand.
Hang on. So you're putting forth that because you think there may be a simpler way to do something that currently executes things, we have no idea how it actually does it. and is able to execute literally millions of different variations of something in a technological manner in which we don't even comprehend. You're saying that we know how to do it better. Is that what you're saying?
If it could be simpler, sure. Because if
But
there's an unnecessary aspect of the design, it does not imply that it was intelligently designed.
But if you're trying to execute a code that contains information with different variables built into it, then you need to have, that's the whole aspect of programming, which is why I'm making this foundational piece of what we're talking about here is whether or not you want to accept it or not, there's every aspect of programming and machine learning and the equivalent of artificial intelligence that we are currently trying to replicate right now. Human scientists are trying to copy what we're seeing being executed inside of our cells. And in every aspect, it is programming logic and AI. So you're saying that, are you saying that because our bodies and the requirements for us to exist do things that we can't yet do, but we wish we could, and are requiring the literally hundreds of millions of genius brain hours of humans to try and replicate, that doesn't imply that a intelligent agent of supreme level might also have been required to make those things happen?
Well, since it self-improves all the time, then it could be better. Like, they actually use evolutionary models to design proteins that are better than the naturally occurring proteins.
Now, a lot of times they're not necessarily better. They're different, and they do different functions that the other ones might not
Better
do.
for a certain function. Yeah, there's no such thing as like universally better.
Right. So if humans are being required to create these new functional proteins, why would you not also conclude that the information that houses the instructions in our genetic code that is sent via a translation and encode decode process to a microscope or a molecular robot machine that reads said code and builds nanomachine robots, like, I'm not following how you don't see that intelligence would be required for that to happen versus chance occurrence of something that is so complicated we barely understand it and are having to apply supercomputers. And it's one of the biggest reasons for quantum computing being developed, is to try and figure out how to understand the outcomes, since from a chemistry and an atomic level, the variations are so dynamic that they can hardly ever figure them out. Even if they have a good idea of what might happen, very often the outcomes are different than what they expected because they don't understand the variables.
Well, the example I gave isn't actually done by intelligence. They're actually turning to non-intelligent natural methods to do it for them because they can't do it intelligently.
And what are they using to do that?
They're using models of naturally occurring mechanisms.
Structures and fundamental molecular machine outcomes. But then what are they using to actually project and to execute those new ideas?
So are you saying if anyone does anything in a lab, that's just intelligent design?
No, I'm suggesting
or a
that
computer lab?
No, I'm suggesting that if let me back up. Do you think that the proteins, and many of them, not all of them are just more catalysts and whatnot, but many of the proteins that enable life, do you think they are just random chemical reactions, or do you think they actually operate as nanomachines?
Well, I believe that they were evolved.
No, I said, what do? Do they act as nanomachines or just random chemical reactions?
They act based on the laws of chemistry.
What is there's a lot of things that operate under the laws of chemistry. That's literally everything. So
I wouldn't call it a nanomachine because it doesn't have like a brain.
So nanomachines don't have brains. Nanomachines have programming. And
yeah, that's what I mean.
And programming requires logic and
a protein doesn't have programming.
Well, have you not studied biological computation? Because that's an entire division of biology, literally trying to figure out the computational ability of cellular mechanisms and proteins. But in context of the
so it's the interactions between them that the computation emerges from.
In some aspects,
the individual protein doesn't itself have a computer inside of it.
Well, not necessarily a computer in the context that we're talking about, but do the proteins physically act as machines and with specific functions to execute outside of just a base chemical reaction?
It's a great analogy for some proteins.
So you're still circumventing the question. So it has been directly stated by many folks publicly of extreme renown that we cannot try and differentiate, but they are nanomachines, and they have animated them and shown exactly the functions they do, as I'm sure you probably have seen. So I don't know why you're dodging this. And they have motors. They have the equivalent of wheels. They can do all sorts of functions external to base chemical reactions. It has been publicly stated on many occasions that the more we learn about biology, the more that deterministic chemistry is no longer a viable explanation for the outcome because of all of the upstream, downstream outcomes that are being executed by the nanomachines inside of our bodies. So the point I'm making is that if all of this source information is housed in a genetic code that has syntax, semantics, and pragmatics, accounts for variables, expresses machine learning capabilities, and then when executed results in nanorobots, in what other context, if we started bringing nano cars around that are on the size of molecules, which we're building right now, would you ever conclude that a nano car that's been built could have just popped into existence when you look at the 300 pages of processes that were required at specific times, functions, heat, start, stop, add this, add that, and it takes months of extraordinarily coordinated controls in a controlled lab to have an outcome of something that is a joke compared to the extraordinarily complex nanomachines that enable us to exist.
What was the question?
The question is, if somebody brought a nano car to you and showed you all of the processes that were required to build it, would you ever conclude that car had magically come into existence, even though it was natural chemical processes that ultimately resulted in that car? That's a couple molecules put together in specific format. It now can literally act like a car on the molecular level. Would you conclude that just because they used chemistry to make that happen, that car formed itself?
It depends.
So you're now dodging. So you would, in what context?
Really.
In which context would you say the car formed itself?
In a context where, if we had observed these things improving themselves and building themselves without intelligent influence, then I would have to study it and explore it. I wouldn't just assume some false dichotomy that if it's not evolved naturally, then it had to have been done by God.
So you are saying, if I'm understanding you correctly, you are saying that nanotech machines can form themselves without the original requirement of a designer and for the information that is required to allow for any kind of variations. You're saying that those things can just happen. Is that correct?
Are you talking about like a metal nano car?
No, I'm talking about a molecular nano car.
Okay, so if it was molecular, I'd be more willing to believe that it was naturally formed. If it was like made out of metal and clearly had specs for it and there was a factory for it, then I wouldn't believe that it was naturally made. And sometimes we can just say, I don't know.
Okay, so let me make sure I understood you correctly.
We'll
you just
have to
said
look more into it.
if there was a factory for a car that you would expect that it would have been designed. Is that basically what you just said?
Yeah.
Okay. So what is the ribosome and what is the DNA? Is it the information that goes into the factory or the mRNA, which is transcribed, to do it? And then what happens with the chaperones and the variety of other things after it leaves the ribosome to form the end product? How is that not directly corollary to what you just said on the macro level versus the micro?
Because nothing that we can observe about any of that has an intelligent mind. You're just inferring it because of the complexity.
No, that's why I gave the example of a nanocar, which there's a whole global contest for molecular nanocars, by the way. It's a direct corollary. In order to create nanomachines on the molecular level that are not anywhere close to as advanced as the ones that are recognized in biology, it requires extraordinarily complex brain power in order for them to be achieved. And there's crazy awards if you're able to do so and build something that's functional. So the point I'm making is, and this is why I'm posing the question to you, is if on the macro level, a car requires a factory, which requires a designer and an operator and all those different components to ultimately come up with the end product, and the fundamentals that enable life to exist require source code, factories, additional touch-ups and modifications for the end result, different regulatory variables that can change the outcome based on on the car, it's the paint color. On the protein, it might be a slight variation for XYZ stress scenario. I'm not understanding how you do not see the direct corollary between the two. On one side, you'd be considered an idiot to claim that it happened by accident. On the other side, something that is exponentially more complicated and more intricate, you're saying could happen by chance. You're not following the level of dichotomy here?
Yeah, I'm following it. I just don't see how, it's not fully solved. So we don't know. The trajectory seems like it's going to be figured out. But let's assume that life was intelligently designed. How can we assume that it's a god? Maybe it's just aliens who have a simpler biology.
So you're saying something that is less complex than us also somehow came into existence without a designer and
less complex biologically.
And made us that are more complex.
Why not?
Who created the aliens?
Who created God?
That's irrelevant to the natural requirements that we're looking at here. What are the variables? What are the variables that are required to be in place for, in the context of our existence, what is required? And the point I'm making is that in no other context, in chemistry, mechanics, in industry, any other aspect of modern technology, would we argue that all of the technology that we're using to have this communication right now, I've got a microphone, I've got this thing that's trying to insulate the echoes, I've got a webcam, my desktop, it's going through the internet over to yours, and that information is being translated from ether into a visualization for us. And it's taking my voice, translating information, and doing the same thing. Would you ever argue that any of this stuff that is enabling us to have this debate right now could ever exist by chance without intelligent agents being required?
No, because it's got a specific purpose and doesn't change on its own and doesn't self-replicate.
Okay, so earlier, as I was saying, in context of the self-replication aspects, is such a common pushback, is the capacity for doing all of the things that a computer can do, or in similar context, from an information transfer perspective and functions and whatnot, our bodies do, but on a even greater level with a whole crapload of different things that our computers never could. and they have the ability to do machine learning and have the equivalent of AI operating to account for new variables. My point is that we, and I said this earlier, we as humans are trying to make our computers and our technology be able to do what our biology can do. If with our most advanced tech, we can't pull this off, why would you think that something that is that complicated and that intricate and that has that many dependent parts is going to spring into existence even over billions of years? I don't care how many infinite universes you have. It's literally like saying that all the things we just talked about from a technology perspective, if you gave it a billion years and infinite universe, or billions of years and infinite universes, somehow they would pop into existence. So unless you're willing to conclude that all these technologies can just happen, then you have to look at the same argument in regards to the biological level, because they're extraordinary. They're direct corollaries.
I don't see any corollary.
So you said you are studying cellular biology, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So how are information signals sent cellular from an intracellular perspective?
A lot of different ways.
Okay.
What are you looking for?
How is it physically? How is it sent, and what is the outcome? In just a few instances, what is happening in the process of the information transfer?
It's not an information transfer. It's just a chemical that causes something else to happen chemically.
Okay, so not to be a jerk here, man, but you seriously need to go read some papers on this, because it is directly posited to be information. That's why it's one of the greatest conundrums that is facing the neo-Darwinians. They can no longer avoid the fact that it's information, and it's being translated dynamically into alternative outcomes. So in terms of gene expression, when signals are sent to the cell, what's going on, and are there if then and else variables that are being executed when that supposed just random chemical signal comes to the outside of the cell?
Well, it's not random. It's very specific. That's why you get a specific result.
So it's very specific signal that results in the outcome of information execution.
It's not information. And no one who actually teaches or studies biology uses those words. We don't use that in the lab. I can tell you that much. It's a nice analogy.
Dude, okay, don't try the analogy thing, man. Are you an undergrad or grad school?
Undergrad. I'm on my senior year.
Okay. Well, I think you need to start reading some of the published papers on this topic, where they dive into the specifics of the information component. And to be honest, man, the atheist argument, and I'm not accusing you of being a direct atheist, I'm just using it as a talking point. I cannot tell you the number of times I hear that it's not really information and it's not really code. And the foundational component of their argument is that those things require intent. And the intent that is obvious from the outcome, because in any other aspect, it fulfills every component of information technology, information processing, information theory, and communications theory. And you can't avoid it. And you need to go and read the papers on this, because it is everywhere. And on the surface level, people try to avoid this. If you actually go and read the thing, go read the papers from the Royal Society and all these other folks around the world who are literally stating it is a real code, it is programming language, and this is the single greatest conundrum that we face in biology, is trying to figure out how in the heck this is remotely possible.
It's not really that big of a mystery. And I'm not calling it information because I'm trying to avoid something. I just think that that's the wrong word, because information to me means this is a definition, facts provided or learned about something or someone. So I'll give you information. It doesn't change anything for me.
I'm so sorry to interrupt, guys. We got 5 minutes left on the clock for the discussion. Just want to let you know the live chat's having a great time. This is a phenomenal debate. So 5 minutes left, and then we'll jump into some really quick closings so you guys can kind of wrap up your points, and then we'll jump into a Q&A. Go ahead.
So I think we've explored this pretty thoroughly. So I'm trying to understand what your ultimate argument is. Like, if we haven't figured out abiogenesis, then therefore what?
No, I'm saying that not only have we not figured out abiogenesis, the requirements for abiogenesis require the development of a information processing code base, or a code base that enables information processing, a molecular factory, and robots for the expression of that information, the ability for a organism to have machine learning capabilities and be dynamic based on external variables, and to do things that we only dream of our technologies being able to do. And given the fact that I don't think any sane human would actually conclude that your computer and all the software on it or on your phone could ever come into existence without the requirement of an intelligent agent, then I do not know how something that has all those components plus is more complicated and has way more functionality could also have come into existence without the requirement of an intelligent agent. And to me, we can go deep into the scientific aspects of it and philosophical, but when you boil it all the way down to the root, what are people trying to escape? If you avoid the logical, plausible, and probable conclusion that a higher power exists based on all those pieces, plus all the philosophical ones and all the other different, literally hundreds of thousands of hours of people are debating this stuff on the different indices of God's existence, it does not become a difficult conclusion. Now, whether or not you want to argue over which religion is the right one, which God is the actual one, is a totally different debate, versus is it the more reasonable conclusion that we are not just the result of purely naturalistic and materialistic processes, or are we the result of an intelligent agent leveraging those processes in order for us to exist?
So if we give credence to this problem, then the same problem is applied to whatever that creator is. So I don't. It's a non-starter to me. It's just the incredulity fallacy. Like, you can't figure out how it happened, therefore it had to have been like some uber intelligent mind.
No, I'm saying the intelligent mind requirement is indicated by the evidence that we've just been talking about tonight.
So with the existence of a God, though, because a God is far more complicated than anything we've been talking about.
Hang on. Going into the who designed the designer argument is I honestly find that counter to be quite hysterical. So
it seems fair to me, and we've only got a couple minutes left.
No, okay, let's actually think about this for a second. If we don't have the mental capacity to actually even comprehend our own existence, how then would we actually have the capacity to comprehend how the agent that actually did it exists? So trying to figure that out is like, a ant trying to figure out how the universe exists in the first place too. It's the same comparison. Doesn't matter if it's an ant or us trying to figure it out. It's something that's beyond, in terms of, I'm talking about the existence, not whether or not it exists. How it exists, that's all philosophical debate. And trying to go down the infinite regress of the who designed the designer argument is it's an interesting one, but also it requires there to be time being the ultimate factor. We are mentally and physically bound by space and time, but we don't necessarily know, and there's plenty of physicists postulating theories now that time is purely an illusion. So if that is the case, then the whole premise of who designed the designer is completely false, or it's completely ridiculous one to even debate in the first place. If right now in the material form is the only time that time itself exists. So the argument goes nowhere. But it still doesn't alter whether or not it's reasonable to conclude that that designer is there in the first place.
I think it does go somewhere, because you're saying you have no idea how to even begin addressing it, and yet it's the same problem because God is still more complex than all of this. So
Do we know who
using
the
the
first
same logic, we have to say, how did this come about?
who designed the first wheel?
I don't know.
I don't either. Does the wheel exist?
Yeah.
Okay.
So
we know there was an intelligent agent that created the first wheel.
It had
right?
a designer, though. So by that logic, your God also has a designer.
Okay.
So,
What's more complicated? Humans, or by any the simplest form of life. What's more complicated, it or a wheel?
life.
Okay. But
And yet the simplest life cannot even dream of making a wheel. So making a wheel is actually more complicated than any of the simplest life.
Okay, so you just said that the life form required to make a wheel is extraordinarily complex, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so technologically, the simplest form of life is more complicated than the wheel. But to make a wheel, you have to have intelligence. Is that your position?
Yeah.
Okay, so if it requires intelligence to make a wheel, but the simplest organism is more complicated than the wheel, why would it not be the logical conclusion that intelligence was required to create the simplest form of life?
Because we know that most of those components can form naturally. And the fact that logic that you always need something more complicated to make something less complicated just results in an infinite regress problem.
No, it doesn't result in an infinite regress problem, because the standard position for the intelligent creator or the intelligent higher agent is that they are immaterial, not material. And there's plenty of stuff we can go on down the quantum mechanics route if you want to, but there are many elements of the immaterial that circumvent the infinite regress argument. And the infinite regress applies to the physical world, not to something that is external to it.
How do you know that?
Guys, that's about time, but I don't want to cut you off, Snake. Did you want to maybe respond to that in like a quick closing, or did you want to respond to it here as like an end to the discussion? What do you guys think?
Well, I would like a bit of a closing, but
oh yeah, of course, yeah, we'll do. I guess my question would be, like, in response to what John just said, did you want to kind of respond to that in your closing, or did you want to have a couple quick words now?
Yeah, I mean, because at some point you're saying that something complex can just appear from nowhere, or just have always existed, or form from something simpler. So,
I never say anything about forming from something simpler.
Well, I said and or. So this infinite regress is actually a big problem, and I don't understand how we can state with any confidence that something supernatural wouldn't follow this same logic. It's just exempted because of special pleading for some reason. That's my whole problem.
You're missing the point on this. Number one, the elements that I would wager you're using to make it a special pleading are based on the restrictions inside of the physical world. If
not necessarily,
the primary mover has to be external from it, number one. But
why?
Well, if you
at some point you're saying it just exists, and so why couldn't that just apply to the physical world?
Let's cut this down. So, because I know we got to go to the Q&A. This is why I was bringing up the wheel. So let's say we're at an auditorium and there's two folks like us standing on either side, and we're historians, right? And we stand there and argue that on one side is that the light bulb, through the course of mechanical natural selection and chance, somehow formed itself. And on the other side is another person saying, that is ridiculous. There is no way this technology came into existence without an intelligent agent. And we're assuming we don't know who Thomas Edison is, right? But light bulbs are just here. And then the other person says, well, I agree that there must have been an intelligent agent who created the light bulb. However, I do not know who the parents of the designer of the light bulb were. Therefore, the designer was not required for the light bulb to exist. That is philosophically, you can go down the mind-bending enigma of what was the ultimate cause of the first cause. I'm arguing right now, I'm not arguing that portion of it. I'm arguing that the evidence indicates that just like the light bulb would have required a designer, even if we don't know, and it's logical to conclude there was a designer, even if we don't know who the parents of the designer were, the same logic applies to our very existence. And just because we can't answer that question doesn't mean that, hey, the incredibly improbable that is so far beyond the level of reason that we have to use terms like frozen accident being required for life to exist, being the logical, plausible, and probable conclusion to how we're here in the first place.
But light bulbs don't self-improve, so we can't reverse that into something that's simpler and simpler and simpler.
As much as we want to, well, it's been very entertaining, very engaging, awesome discussion. Actually, I've let it go on probably another 15 minutes or so. But we do have a lot of really, really good questions as well for both you guys. Did you want to kind of wrap up your points in the form of like a concluding statement? You can go over anything you feel was unaddressed or anything you'd like to say. I know Snake, you started, right?
Yes.
So we could have you kind of wrap it up, give your final thoughts, a flexible closing, a couple minutes, and then we'll allow John to do the same.
All right. So, I mean, I kind of stated that my final point is something that can self-improve. We can kind of walk it back and say, okay, so at what point was its original form that it improved from? So I think evolution is very well established in terms of how it got there in the first place. It could be anything. It could be magical pixies made it. It could be aliens that have a much more easily created, not created, but a biology that is much more probable could have created us. It could be a different god. And so I'm sat here being like, well, we don't know, so we can't just assume what it is just because we don't have an explanation along this route, even though it's like 90% there. You can't logically just go, okay, well, therefore it was God. That's a fallacy. And I don't see how a mind at all can be the origin of the universe, or maybe it could be like the second thing that exists, but this mind would have to have components to it, and it has complexity. And so if we're going to accept that complexity needs a creator, then at some point you have to have a non-intelligent creator. And so I don't see what's so ridiculous about all these very well-backed theories using just chemical laws. I don't see how that's ridiculous. And the reason I say a mind can't be the origin of the universe is because it has parts. At least I can point to the Christian God has at least 3 parts. And the fact that facts and just the rules of how minds, even the mind of God, must work, must pre-exist that mind and must exist independently of that mind and cannot be changed by that mind. A mind cannot be the origin of the universe because a mind is the correlation of those many parts and facts and a mind can be wrong. It can hold paradoxes and say and do illogical things, but the universe itself does not behave that way. So there must be some fundamental fact that has to behave in a certain way that the mind of God is following. So at some point, an intelligent being is being created by non-intelligent things. And I think I've covered the infinite regress problem. I don't think you can make a special exception for just calling it supernatural does not satisfy. I don't see how we can just leap logically to, well, just apply the label of supernatural to it, and it no longer follows the laws of logic. So if you're going to say that something absolutely cannot be created by something simpler than itself, even though we see that all the time, then you have to apply that logic universally if you're going to accept it. And I guess I'll... I wanted to state that I would find it very useful if God could just, if he exists, he could just come down here and prove me wrong right now and just clear up all of this debate and all of this confusion. That would be very helpful to us. So we wouldn't have to be in confusion all the time. The greatest scientific minds in the world tend to agree with abiogenesis. So I don't, unless you're going to call all of them insane, I guess it's possible in some abstract sense that everyone has it all wrong. And then I'll end with, I guess, a little syllogism here, where the first premise is, if God exists, we can only confirm this with logical reasoning, and the second premise is logic is a valid means of knowing things, and therefore we have to confirm logic is true before we can even confirm the existence of any gods. And thus, basically what I'm saying is that knowledge, whatever makes knowledge work, precedes God, because God has to follow this, and we have to know it works before we can even argue for a God in the first place. So I guess that's it.
Okay, thanks so much there, Snake, for your concluding statement. John, you get the same amount of time. You can start whenever you're ready.
So I find the argument of, I wish God would just come down and show me, to be very ironic, as it comes from so many of the agnostic and atheist activists, the Matt Dillahuntes, now the Snake folks of the world constantly make that argument. I wish God would just show me. Well, we haven't been debating religion, but from the Christian perspective, Christ did come to this earth and tell us that he was God and gave us a road to salvation. So to make that argument that why doesn't God come down here, well, you're just having to ignore the fact that God did come down here. But that aside, in Romans, it's a very interesting passage where it says that, basically paraphrasing here, that the wonders of nature are there to show the average person that God exists. Therefore, we are without excuse to accept his existence. And, when you talk about logic and acceptance of, evidence of God and things of that nature, if you're going to suspend the exact same logic rules that would apply in any other context of what is designed and what has been created by intelligence, if you're going to suspend those logic rules, if you will, in the context of biological systems and extrapolates out to the universe, but specifically in context of biology, if those same rules don't apply, then how can you argue that there is not evidence that can logically be considered as a steps towards that conclusion that God exists? And so many of these things, I see these arguments and these positions being taken, and folks are it's obvious to me that folks are desperate to avoid the reality that God does exist. And if they, even for a moment, will blink and begin to accept that the evidence is there, then they will be forced, not only from an intellectual perspective, but also from a philosophical and emotional and a spiritual perspective, will be forced to consider what this means in terms of their purpose in life and their morality and what they should do and what are the things that they are put on this earth to engage in, and is there a purpose beyond just random chance and chaos and all these different things that have no ultimate bearing from a macro point of view, and are therefore looking to find any way to circumvent these questions. Now, in context of the supposed acceptance of abiogenesis by top scientists, again, Snake, I strongly suggest you go and actually do some origin of life research and actually read the papers that are coming out, because they are not in any way, shape, form, or fashion close. Per their own admission, they are not close to having any kind of idea. What they tell people in lower level textbooks and on the news and the Neil deGrasse Tysons and all those folks and the Richard Dawkinses of the world that run around telling everybody that it's an answered question and we all know exactly what's going on, that nothing could be further from the truth in the context of the real research. And I recommend anybody who has not actually gone down and read the publications for themselves and listened to them and read where they literally state, we have no idea how this happened. And things like neo-Darwinism collapsing, all of the discoveries in epigenetics and the machine learning capabilities that we're discovering are completely eviscerating the foundational premises of Darwinism. And yet we're still being told that 99% of scientists agree, when some of the top Evo-Devo researchers on this planet are arguing the exact opposite in their papers. So take the time, actually go do research, and don't just buy into the talking points on the surface level that they are not dramatic consternations arising on a daily basis as to the explanation for how we exist, and as the technological, not just analogies, but the realistic and the literal technologies that make us exist are discovered. Unless you are willing to conclude that they can come into chance by existence, then it is the reasonable, the logical, the plausible, and the probable conclusion that a higher power exists. And then what you do with that understanding is up to you from a religious perspective.
Awesome. Well, thank you there, John, for your concluding statement. Just want to say this was a really, really good debate. The discussion, the audience loved. We had a really, really big audience, good audience. Everybody's having some lively chat in there. So thanks again to the debaters. We've also got a lot of good questions here that we're going to get into. We got about a 25-minute Q&A. So I'll try and get through as many as I can. There are a lot. For each question, though, I can allow for quick responses or a very short back and forth from the debaters during the Q&A, but I'll have to cut it off when necessary in order to just get through as many of these questions as possible. So that being said, we'll go to the first question. First question is from Ray Vincent. Thanks for your question, Ray. Question is for Snake Was Right. I'll read it word for word. He asks, do you think or believe there are things out in the world that are unexplainable? For example, X might happen, but we can't explain it.
Obviously, we don't know everything. I don't think it's fundamentally unexplainable for all time, but there are things that we don't know, sure. And I don't think it's appropriate to just say, well, then therefore ghosts or God or whatever.
Awesome. Now, would you like a quick response to that, John, or you want me to go on to the next?
I'll be short and pithy, as James at MDD likes to say. The jumping to ghosts and God is, I keep saying this, but the entire point of this is that we are not talking about ghosts and God in relation to the unexplainable. We are looking at it from a realistic perspective. As I said in my opening statement, there's plenty of things that are improbable. Innumerable things that are improbable, but become possible with an intelligent agent. But we also can accept that it is impossible to have happened without the intelligent agent. And to suspend that requires a lack of logic and rationality that would be used in any other context. And then to claim that it's ghosts or God as the explanation for why an intelligent agent is required, as I said all throughout tonight, is just an attempt to avoid the reality of that being the right conclusion.
Okay, well, thanks for that, those responses, gentlemen. Next question is for John. John, this question is from Troy Gomez. Thanks for the question there, Troy. He asks, what is a good example of the neo-Darwinian paradigm collapsing?
Well, I would say the third wave evolution conference that was, I think it was back in 2016 or 2017, which was 100 of the top evolutionary biologists on the planet all got together specifically for the purpose of, hey, we got to come up with a different theory because the foundation of slow change, et cetera, of the foundational components of neo-Darwinism are no longer viable given what we basically discovered in the last 15 to 20 years, but especially in the last decade with epigenetics and a variety of other the systems, cellular systems components and the dynamic aspects of biology of they're being able to observe things that are completely opposite to Darwinian theory, neo-Darwinian theory specifically. And so, and there's tons of papers on this. Anyway, I would just go research some of the collapse of neo-Darwinism papers. The Royal Society's got quite a few of them published, but there's Nature's got several. I think 2018 there was a paper by, look it up again. The entire paper was eviscerating Darwinian theory and how, from the public perspective, everything was hunky-dory and it's totally understood and solved. But then on the flip side, hey guys, it's completely collapsed and we have to actually come up with a realistic alternative and stop saying that modern synthesis of neo-Darwinism is viable.
And would you like a quick response to that there, Snake?
Yeah, I don't think that that's supported by any of the scientific evidence at all, or else they would have already abandoned evolution as a concept.
Okay.
I said it in context of neo-Darwinism and modern synthesis.
Okay, well, thanks for the responses there. We've got this question is from Science is Observable. This question is for Snake. So the question is, if the process of macroevolution is not observable and nothing in science is truly settled, as they say, then how can you claim evolution has passed the scientific method? Take your time.
Because if we're going to say that only things that are absolutely known that cannot be overturned by anything, that's something that is unfalsifiable unless it is not science. So if it's science, it has to be falsifiable. So, and macroevolution has been observed. Macroevolution just talks about speciation, and every creationist institute that I've looked into has admitted macroevolution. Basically, for example, the horse has evolved from three-toed to single-toed, and that's not possible without some very complex changes that would be described as only possible with an intelligence. And yet they have to admit that this is possible in order to fit them on the ark. Other things would include muscle groups found only in certain weasels and otters that they all say are related. So,
quick response there, John?
been observed.
Oh, thanks, Stink.
Well, on the horse thing, I mean, obviously, the only evidence on that is fossils. And one of the things I often like to respond in that context is, that dogs have claws and toes equivalent that range in, I think, from like, I forget the exact numbers, but it's very significant ranges. Yet nobody would argue that they are not dogs from a genetic perspective. But beyond that, and this, we didn't really talk about this too much in context of the fossils, but if I took a skeleton of a dachshund and a Great Dane, and you'd never seen either one of them before, it would be extraordinarily difficult to know 100% beyond all doubt that A, they're the same species, and B, whether or not one evolved from the other. And that logic can be extrapolated out in many, many ways. And if your mindset and your worldview is that they must have evolved, then your conclusions on skeletal remains are going to take a very different path, while not accounting for the variability within species that can be an outcome without a full-scale body plan modification new body plan being created via chance and natural selection. Do we lose Snake?
Yeah, we lost him, but I'm sure he'll be back in 10 seconds or so. It happens once in a while. So thanks for the response, John. We do have the next question would be for you. So in order to avoid dead air, I guess I can ask you the question. Once Snake comes back, we'll go to him for one of his questions. So John, this question is for Gavin in the chat. Thanks for the question, Gavin. He asks, what do you say to atheists who can't tell you where DNA comes from?
Okay, repeat that. What do I say to atheists when they what?
So he asked, what do you say to atheists who can't tell you where DNA comes from?
Yeah, well, if they can't tell me where it came from, I usually give them a breakdown of the genetic code, the different components, the process of gene expression, the different protein robots that are required for its expression, the factory element of the ribosome, and then kind of expand upon how it is not only is it have all of the baseline components of computer code, it is superior to anything we've ever come up with. And in the context of its existence, and this is why I get so not irritated, but frustrated and entertained by the, it replicated argument that comes back on all this stuff. Is like, okay, there's pretty much every programmer on this planet could write a script into their web app that they created, or their mobile app, that says, hey, do a batch job every 24 hours, every 8 hours, every 6 hours, whatever, and do a replication. And hey, we're gonna have 2 copies of you. And I also want you to merge databases and source code. And I mean, I could write that script in 15 minutes. You can go to GitHub and get that logic in 2 seconds and implement that into your system. But the premise that your source, your initial app that you created is going to transform itself into an entirely different app is just by having a script that allows for replication and merging. It doesn't matter how much time you have. You would never conclude that all these new functions are going to suddenly spring into existence. And that is not just a analogy, but a direct comparison, but even dumbed down in regards to what is required for life to have followed the logical positions that are being taken by the Darwinian worldview.
Awesome. Well, thanks there, John. Snake, we're happy to have you back just in time for a question from Bill Morgan. He says, question for Snake. What is your strongest argument that life arose from non-life by natural means? Take your time.
I can't sum it up in a couple sentences, but it's a biogenesis. And basically, to sum it up, it would be most of the components of life have been able to self-assemble in natural circumstances, and they've actually, it's kind of a forgotten experiment, but it's called G-Wanu, is actually a self-replicating complex of molecules that behaves a lot like life. And so life isn't just like, it's not like once you reach a level of complexity where it just suddenly turns on in its life. It's a huge spectrum. So,
Awesome.
and what's up, Bill? Email me. I know you have my email to set up that follow-up debate.
Yeah, we definitely love to host that. The first debate between you guys was a blast. So was there a quick response from you there, John?
Now we can go on to the next one.
Okay. So next question is for Snake. This is from Science is Observable. Thanks for your question. He asks, how do you reconcile evolutionary theory with irreducible complexity in cell biology? Take your time.
There is no irreducible complexity, is the thing. So, I mean, it's a false premise. There are ways we've shown that irreducibly complex systems can actually be built from simple code. I can make can show you a demonstration or something, but not while my computer's on the fritz.
Well, thanks for that answer, Snake. Quick response, John, or on to the next one?
Now, being able to reverse engineer which parts would be needed for a simpler version of a functional outcome is, to be honest, I don't even know how some of these guys with PhDs, like Kenneth Millers of the world and whatnot, make these arguments, especially when they're reducing it to individual component functions of a larger macro system. And, one of the greatest areas of biology right now is the whole aspect of systems biology. And they're discovering more and more each day that the systems work as a unit. And this is applied in context of DNA, right? So they've realized that DNA is dynamic, but it's dynamic because of system components that exist inside the overall cell and the extracellular systems that it works directly with. So to say that you can dumb down a bicycle into a wheel does not mean that you don't have to have a frame and the handles and the brakes and everything else for the bike to actually work. And, I have a wheel, therefore I could have created a unicycle out of it, doesn't mean that in order for it to be a bicycle, all of the pieces don't have to be there at the same time.
Thanks for that response there, John. Quick final comment on that question there, Snake, since it was yours, or go on to the next question?
Well, I know he hates it, but obviously bikes don't self-replicate or self-improve, so I don't see how that's a good analogy.
Well, I'm pretty sure that things like the bacterial flagellum are the equivalent of turbines. And unless you have the factory components and the design schematics for a turbine for your factory to build, then it also wouldn't self-replicate. So you have to go back to the root of the argument, which is where did the information come from, which enables the expansion. Even if you want to go from a simple perspective, you still have to have design capabilities and the ability to encode that information into an executable chemical medium. And that has not been explained. And the information for even a unicycle versus a bicycle both of them still have complexity, and both of those would still require a designer, just like a turbine would, as well as anything, the rotor component of the turbine. And you can't actually reduce it without removing the information requirement from the equation. You can't just have the parts. You have to have how the parts come together in the first place.
There are simpler functional components of the flagellum.
That's what I'm referring to. I understand there's simpler components of the flagellum. I'm saying that they have functions in completely different context of.
That's not a problem, though.
Man, you won't even admit that there is information that is in the gene sequences, even though that's an accepted premise, and it houses the instructions for the outcome. And there are literally thousands of variables that have to all be done in synchronicity for genes to be expressed. And there has to be there's very often external signaling that's going on separate for all of this, and in order for these things to have the outcome. But you think it's simple. And none of that stuff's required, even though it's an accepted fact that it is. Let's go on to the next question.
Okay.
It was simple.
All right. Fun back and forth there, guys. Like I said, it's been a great debate. So we've got Bill Morgan here, though. He's coming at you there, John. The question that he has for you is, he says, the human liver performs only 500 functions vital for life. John, why don't you believe that can happen over billions and billions of years? Isn't that science? Question mark.
So the question is, the liver has 500 functions. Could they have happened by over billions of years?
Yes, Bill Morgan's asking, why don't you believe that the
Okay,
function,
I got you.
Yeah.
I got you. The outcome. Okay. How many sub requirements are there for the factory that creates a screwdriver or creates a set of lug wrenches and the ratchet and all the different nuts and whatnot? Just because it only makes 500 different variables doesn't mean there aren't millions of subset logic components and design factors have to be in place before it can work. And I would argue, and I would happily eat my hat if there are less than I would wager, if you factor in all the probabilities of the 500 function of a liver, I bet that is no less than 1 in 10 to the 100th power. If it's less than that, I'll eat my hat.
Awesome. Thanks for that answer there, John. Quick response there, Snake?
Yeah, basically all things in evolution are based on a modification of something that already exists, and a slight modification can give a totally new function to it. So, like the simpler components, I never said it was simple, but it's more simple than the modern flagella. Those simpler components, if they're slightly changed, can cause a different function. And it doesn't matter if it has a completely different function. If the underlying structures are mostly the same, then they can be modified. And it could have a different function, it could have a similar function, it could have an improved function, or it could just have a totally different function. And a lot of the enzymes in the liver are based on very similar molecules.
Okay, well, thank you, gentlemen. Next question is from Anthony Maurice. The question is for Snake. He asks, are you aware of all the problems associated with the RNA world hypothesis?
Yeah, there's a couple problems, and there's a lot of problems with abiogenesis. And like I said, we don't know everything about it, and we can't therefore just conclude, therefore God did it.
A few minutes ago, didn't you just say that 90% of the scientists understand abiogenesis? You literally said that in your close.
Well, I threw out some number like 90% is understood. I didn't say 90% of scientists do, but something
scientists say that 90% is understood.
Something like 99% of scientists understand what's been studied so far.
You need to go watch some of Lee Cohen's interviews.
There are close to 0% of scientists who say, therefore God did it.
Okay, man.
Okay, well, what we'll do here is we've got, we're coming on the 2 hour mark, so I don't want to keep everybody all night. So we're going to end with a bang. We've got one last question from Bill Morgan. We'll let you both respond a little bit to it. Question, though, is for Snake. Here, I lost it here. Question for Snake. What came first, proteins or DNA?
Probably DNA. And I did have one last thing to say, if I'm allowed to.
Sure, go ahead.
But we can let John answer this question first, if he wants to respond.
Yeah, if you want to respond to Snake's answer there regarding Bill's question, you can, John.
That would be a long response, but I don't. In order for life to exist, they would have to have both been in existence at the same time. So unless you want to postulate that something that is so improbable, there hasn't been enough chemical interactions in the history of the 13.81 billion year old universe, and our planet's only been around for 4.54, whatever they claim. Not enough time has happened for that level of improbability. So I don't really think it's an argument other than they have to have been in existence at the same time for life to work.
Okay, and response from you there, Snake. I know you wanted to say something.
Well, I mean, like I said, RNA and DNA can self-assemble and do stuff without proteins, so that's just the justification for my answer. But what I didn't get to before is I noticed a couple times John has said that I'm just trying to avoid the conclusions of God and or some variations of that. When really I just want him to know as we close out that that's actually I would much prefer God to exist, and I'm not trying to avoid it. I'd be running towards it at full speed if there was actually any information that I could study about it. That is actually my bias. I want there to be a God and an afterlife and all those things. I just don't see any evidence of it, similar to I don't see any evidence that I have a mansion and have $1 million in my bank account. And so maybe I can be fuel for further discussions, because I actually would love you to be right and for me to be wrong. I want that, but I don't see it. So,
final thoughts, John?
Well, actually, Snake, I actually made several caveats on. I tried to distinguish you from the direct atheists. I said, I think I mentioned that you had said you were searching. So, to be honest, man, I hope you will open your mind to this and try to be very. At the beginning of my opening statement, I said, review the evidence prima facie, right, on its face, and if you will stop looking at DNA as just baseline chemical reactions, man, there's papers out there that literally state deterministic chemistry is no longer a viable explanation for what is happening in biological systems. If deterministic chemistry does not explain how life exists, and the only known way for us to alter those chemical outcomes is to inject variations into them in a controlled fashion that requires intelligence based on knowing the intended end result. Like, I have somebody who's very close to me is a very high level PhD chemist, right? Actually worked under a Nobel Prize winner. And we've had these conversations about, and I've actually asked him multiple questions in the context of, okay, how do you guys pull off XYZ when you're in the lab? And he'll explain like all this stuff that they have to do and whatnot. And I've asked him about what's happening in biology. And he says, oh, dude, that stuff in biology is so much crazier and more complicated. And like, no. He's like, what we're doing is considered cutting edge over here. Yet what's happening on this side is so mind-blowing to the chemists that they can barely even comprehend what's going on. We're talking about guys that are at the absolute peak of creating molecular technologies, and they're looking at what's happening in our bodies and are trying to replicate similar functions to me, when you really think about all the evidence that's sitting there staring you in the face, if you stop believing that it all happened accidentally and you really go and research machine learning and AI and quantum computing and all different pieces that are trying to be done, and then actually apply that logic to what is actually happening in your body, to me, it's an inescapable conclusion that unless you're willing to conclude all of this stuff happened without intelligence being required, which we know it beyond all doubt it is, then how is undirected processes going to result in something that's more dynamic and more complicated than what we're trying to pull off?
Well, maybe you can send me those papers. And I am an atheist, but I would prefer that there was a God. I just don't want to get tricked by any of these like slick sounding arguments. And I think calling it information is a good analogy at best. So.
The biological significance. I'm reading a paper right now from the Royal Society. The biological significance of DNA lies in the role it plays as a carrier of information, especially across generations of reproducing organisms, and within cells as a coded repository of system specification and stability. These roles of DNA do not find any chemical explanation in terms of the average material properties of DNA as an irregular heteropolymer. To understand DNA's biological action, one must go to the detailed molecular level. And then, one also fails to find any simple answer in the DNA of itself, because single molecules can have vastly different biological effects, covering the entire range of possibilities dependent on the molecular biological context, even though they are identical, except for the exchange of a particular one of the 10 to the 9th power nucleotide of blah, 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 blah. Anyway, this drives us immediately to the conclusion that the DNA in organisms functions as information, and that the internal DNA-dependent dynamics of cells embody functional information processing, that is, computation. DNA-based molecular biological computation can be said to control, perhaps even direct, the entire panoply of biochemical events occurring in cells. And this goes on for a long time, but the
so if you could
point I'm making here in reading that is that it is no longer it is not an analogy, and the continued push by that of people, and I'm not saying accusing you of this, but I'm talking about the strongest advocates for atheism pushing back against this, are saying that is not the case, and that is categorically false in the context of the people who are doing the research and writing papers on the subject.
Yeah, I mean, if you could send me that, that'd be great. That's a snippet there doesn't really change any of my understanding of how it works. So I'll just have to read more upon that.
Okay, well, thanks so much, guys. Once again, great debate. Everybody share around. And also, we got a lot more fun in the coming weeks. We got a lot of different debates, streams, and discussions set. So
hey, could you mention those SFT real quick?
Yeah. Oh, yeah, I did in the beginning. There's also a couple more that we're kind of working on, so I won't announce those until we know for sure. Just want to confirm from all the debaters. So once again, thanks so much, guys, for giving us your time. These debates obviously would not be possible if not for you guys. So if you guys had some final words there, just plug in your channels or anything you wanted to say before we call it a night.
Well, subscribe to everyone around. Subscribe and like. I just hit 200 subscribers, so I might do something crazy for that.
Congratulations.
Congrats, man. Yeah, folks, thanks for sticking through me and Snake's back and forth and our jabs, counter punches, and uppercuts being thrown at each other. Go check out Snake stuff. I was looking at some of his stuff earlier, and my channel is over. Just search Logical, Plausible, Probable, and come up there. And hope you'll subscribe. If you have topics you want me to address, shoot me an email to logicalplausibleprobable@gmail.com. And if you want to do a debate with me, just let me know. We'll get it going.
Awesome. I appreciate it. Yeah, it's definitely